I live in the Richmond and I love it because of all the different food and it's super close to Golden Gate Park.
The reason why I love the summer is that my kids usually play around the Moscone Center, they go to the kids museum, so it's a great place to live.
I live in Mission Bay and I love it because it's by Barry's Boot Camp, Phil's Coffee, and I love running along the water right by the ballpark.
I live in the Union Square area, and my favorite part is the activity that's always going on between the residents that live there and the tourists. We're always helping each other out. They're always asking directions and how to get to places.
I live in the Tenderloin, and my favorite part about it is that it's always super, super lively.
I love the Sunset because it's quiet and it's a couple of blocks from the beach. I live on 21st and Judah. I live right next to Golden Gate Park, and it's beautiful. And I enjoy the fog.
Well, there you have it. Who's my neighbor? I'm thrilled to start the series off for us as a church community, and here's why. I believe that this series and the principles we're going to pick up over the next 3 weeks leading into Easter, I believe that these principles have the potential to transform the environment surrounding the places you and I call home. More on that in just a little bit, but I first want to make sure that we're all aware we're 3 weeks away from Easter today. 3 weeks, so if you've got to do some shopping, like my wife's like, it is a great time for her to go get a new dress or whatever. I don't know, ladies, use that, okay? Just use it like, hey, God wants me to have a new dress. Easter. And so 3 weeks away, and it's a huge weekend for the church universally, and it's a huge weekend for our church in particular. On that weekend, we've got 2 days of events on Easter weekend this year. For the first one is Saturday, April 4th, at 10 a.m. at Yerba Buena Gardens. We're going to host our first Easter egg hunt because the city has signed off on something we've been requesting for a few years. So we're thrilled about that, just right over at Yerba Buena Gardens. And it's at 10 a.m. And I think there are 70 to 80 of you that are volunteering for that, which is great. Next week, following both services, will be in the Connection Center for a 5 to 10 minute meeting just to make sure you know what you're doing, that you have the right strategy if you're a face painter or if you're wearing the bunny suit, that you know exactly how you're supposed to act and what's off limits in the bunny suit. And for some of you that might think, and I'm totally cool with the question, like, hey, why are we as a church doing an egg hunt? What's the kind of spiritual implications of that? And what I hope is that as we do this neighboring series over the next 3 weeks, you will understand how awesome it is to be able to build bridges for our neighbors before they might ever want to come hear what we're talking about on Sunday mornings. This provides a great opportunity for them to feel like we're a safe place, people we can trust. We're not some cult out there. And so I think what we learn in these 3 weeks, you'll really understand. For those of you that are like, why would we do that? It'll be a great opportunity for us to connect with families and kids. And then on Sunday, April 5th, Easter Sunday, 3 services that day. It'll be our first Easter in this new space, which is really cool. 8:30, 10, and 11:30 a.m. that day for Easter. And so be praying for all kinds of things, but I want to ask you to do 2 things specifically today. I want you to ask God to play his part towards our Easter weekend, just that God would do the kinds of things, he would bring the kinds of people, he would do the kind of transformation that only he can do. And then secondly, that you and I would play our part by praying. You received a prayer guide today. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. By praying and by inviting other people to be a part of this historic weekend. We should always feel comfortable inviting people in our lives to come to church with us, but more people say yes on Easter Sunday than any other Sunday throughout the year. And so let's take advantage of this great opportunity and help leverage what God wants to do, not just in our lives, in our church, but in our city on a day like Easter. So I hope that you'll get behind that. You know, it's often maybe that you come to something like this and hear someone stand up on the stage and say, hey, there used to be some things in life that I struggled with, but let me tell you how I had this amazing moment. I no longer struggle with it, but I know you guys struggle with it, so let me help you out. I don't want to do that today. What I want to do today is tell you about a struggle that I am currently in the midst of. And you're like, this is awesome. Pastor's going to air his junk, and we're going to laugh and feel good about ourselves, and that's okay. You might, but unfortunately, this isn't a struggle I'm in alone. In fact, I'd be willing to bet, and I know this is saying a lot, but I'd be willing to bet that most of us, and maybe, just maybe even all of us, are in the midst of the struggle that I'm in the midst of right now. Maybe even every single one of us. There are variations to the story that we're struggling with, but here's some version of the story. My life is so busy, or my schedule is so maxed out, or my life is just so hectic that I don't even have time to, and then we could all fill in the blank, right? Some of you, you're working so much, and you would say, my life is so busy, my work makes me so busy, I don't even have time to finish my job. Get a new job. Some of you tell me that you're so busy that you don't even have time to date. Then you're too busy, my friend. Some of you say you don't have time for a vacation and sing us that sad song. So some of us say we're in such a position in our industry or in our company that we don't have time to have a hobby. We don't have time to spend with our friends. We just don't have any time. And you might say, listen, Ben, you should understand that we live in San Francisco. It's 2015. Productivity is king. You don't know the industry. You don't know my job. You don't know my role. You don't know my function. But I want to say to all of us, and I'm always including myself, not hypothetically, but in reality, I want to say to all of us that I think we have forgotten what the essence of life is. I believe that you and I have simply forgotten what the essence of life is. And we can point to our culture, and we can point to our city, and we can point to our boss, and we can point to the high call of God even on our lives. But we've forgotten, because it's understandable that we can't date because we don't have time, or we can't take vacation, or we can't go see our mom and dad because we don't have time, or we don't have time to spend with our kids. That may be understandable, but what if the following statement is true and it's residing over my life and your life right now? Here's the statement. It's a stunner, but I want it to sit with us a while. The statement is this: I'm so busy that I don't even have the time to do what Jesus said is most important. I'm so busy that I don't even have the time to do what Jesus said is most important. My aim today, because I'm sitting in this with you, my aim today is not that we would leave here feeling really guilty about what we're not doing with our time. But my aim for sure is that we would be willing at least to open ourselves to the possibility of rearranging how we spend our time and what our calendars look like, so that we might become more people and we might become more the church that resembles what Jesus thinks is most significant. And what I want to say today, I'll probably throw this disclaimer out a few times just so you know. What we're doing today, this is a starting point for our church, okay? So can we just cast guilt aside, please, since I'm guilty? Anybody? This is not about what should we be guilty about regarding how we spend our time and how we're living our lives. This is just the starting blocks. We're just starting. For most of us, we don't have many veterans in this area we're talking about today, this who's my neighbor thing, but let's just start as rookies together. Are you okay with that? No one has to come in here wearing the neighboring Letterman jacket, all right? No one needs a degree in being a good neighbor. We're just starting kind of freshman 101, let's become good neighbors. Are we okay with that? Because I'm convinced that guilt isn't going to be what helps us the most. I'm convinced that a desire and then being willing to change some things in our schedule will be what helps us the most. And so if you have a Bible, we're in Matthew 22 to start this series off today. Raise your hand if you would like to receive a Bible as a free gift from us to you. Keep your hands up. You'll get one. We're in Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 34, page 537 in the Bibles that we have passed out and we are passing out. And again, I want to say today, it's just okay, let me be open to learning things, even if I've never considered this before. Let me be open, because I know many of you, if the question was asked to you today, do you want to consider important what Jesus thinks is important? Many of you in this room, myself included, absolutely. That's what I'm giving my life to. That's what I want my life to be about. But then we'd have to ask a secondary question. Well, how are we really doing with the things we know Jesus said are most important? So stand with me. Let's look at Matthew 22, 34 through 40. A few comments before we get into the text. You know, in the life of Jesus, it's not often that you see irreligious people having a problem with him. It is very often, however, that we see religious people having a problem with Jesus. In fact, it wouldn't be irreligious people that are going to crucify Jesus, right? It was very religious people that wanted to put him to death because of what he said should be the truth, because he claimed to be the Son of God. And so we encounter him entering a conversation with a Pharisee. He's just had one with a Sadducee. One thing to know about the religious group known as the Sadducees is that they didn't believe the resurrection was possible. So they would have never sang that third song, Brad. Like, we don't believe in the resurrection. And so Jesus has just silenced them on their whole idea of marriage and resurrection. And now he comes to a Pharisee. Here's where we pick up the story in verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he, Jesus, had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Here's the question. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. You may be seated. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So this guy is coming up and he's trying to test Jesus. And the Pharisees would do this throughout the life of Jesus. They would test him about certain things that they knew were the commands of God. And Jesus sort of interpreted them in different ways, and how he did the Sabbath. They didn't want him to heal people on the Sabbath. And his claims to be the Son of God, they thought he was blasphemous. And so on and on. They began to say to Jesus, like, no, we have a problem with the thing you're doing. And so they come in this moment, and it's a lawyer, or a better way to think of it is an expert in the law. Pharisees all knew the law, but this is like their best. You know, it's like if you're going to send someone over during a game of Red Rover, you want to send the person that can break the chain. And so Jesus gets their best, an expert in the law. And the expert in the law asks Jesus a question. He says, Teacher, what is the great commandment? What he's saying to Jesus is, what commandment is most important? Which of the commandments is primary? And he's asking this question, expecting Jesus to give him a singular response. He wants to know, what's the one? And here's what you need to understand about the commandments. In the rabbi culture in the first century, among these Jews, among the Pharisees, even that Jesus would be aware of, there are 613 different commandments. Okay? I would need notes. Anybody else? Which one am I breaking today? 613 commandments that all the rabbis would sort of, consensusly say, these are the commandments. I believe there were 248 positive ones, and then the rest, just do the math, the rest would be the amount of negative ones, more negative than positive. So positive 248, saying, hey, do this, act this way, do this kind of thing. Negative ones being, no, don't do this, don't do that, whatever. And so there are 613 commands, and the lawyer knows this math. He knows there are 613, and so he says to Jesus, out of all 613 commandments, which one is primary? Which one is most important? And so Jesus answers the question, doesn't he? Here's the most important one. Here's the primary one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Does Jesus answer the guy's question? Does Jesus stop with that answer? No. Jesus rolls right past it. Anybody else have people in their lives that when you ask them one question, they answer a question you didn't ask? Anybody? And you're like, I just wanted a yes or no. I didn't want an explanation. I didn't want a lecture. I'm not doing like an encyclopedia search on everything you think you know about this topic. I just want to know yes or no. And they just want to get Jesus. Jesus, tell us what's most important. And he says, you're right. And they would have understood this to be most important. Love the Lord your God with everything that you have, with everything that you are. This matters most. But Jesus didn't stop there. And you know why Jesus didn't stop there? Because Jesus didn't think he could stop there. Jesus isn't just trying to show how much he knows. Does that make sense? He's not saying, hey, the second is like it, and the third is like it, and commandment number 413 is just like the first one, like they're all super important. No. The reason Jesus couldn't stop with the first commandment is because he doesn't see how you can have the first commandment without understanding the second commandment. He doesn't stop with the first commandment because he knows that the second is so similar. It's so alike the first commandment that he would be doing a disservice to the question itself if he didn't include it. But he doesn't just keep going. He doesn't throw in the third commandment, does he? Do you think the third commandment would have been an important one? Helping you out? Sure. Absolutely. but it wouldn't have held the weight that the first and the second one did. So they say to Jesus, Jesus, what's single? What's the singular most important one? What's the greatest commandment? Jesus is like, here's the great one, and then I don't think there's a long pause. He's like, oh, and there's the second one, and the second one, it says in the text, here's why he couldn't leave it out, because he said the second one is like it. It's the same kind of commandment. It's the same sort of directive. It's the same kind of imperative as the first one. You can't really get the first one if you don't understand the second one. And he says the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. And then he makes this really bold statement. Here's why I mentioned two. Look at verse 40. This is Jesus saying, the reason why I had to include the second one is because every other directive that exists, from me to my followers, every other directive flows out of these two. So everything else, all of the 611 other commandments that they would have known well, Jesus is saying everything else flows from these two. I can't just give you one. I've got to give you two because the second one is so like the first one. Now, here's what we have to think. Many of us in this room feel like we have a noble purpose over our lives, and we should. If you know me at all, you know that my favorite thing to talk to you about one-on-one or from this stage is about, wake up to what God's purpose is for your life. What has he wired you for? What has he given you what has he given you to put into practice? What has he given you for a vision over your life? Like, what's that big, grand purpose? And so sometimes I think that we think God gives us a purpose that actually keeps us from doing what he has already told us we need to do. Let me say it this way. It can't be possible that God's purpose for our lives would keep us from being able to do what Jesus said was most important. Hey, Ben, that's a strong statement. It is. Let me say it again. It cannot be possible that God's purpose, no matter how big it seems, it cannot be possible that God's purpose for our lives would keep us from being able to do what Jesus has already declared is most important. If you said to me, Ben, but I think God's called me to do this, and if I do that, it's such a time-consuming thing that I can't do the second commandment, then it probably isn't that. Like, how do you know? I don't know specifically what God's called you to. I don't always know specifically what God's called me to, but God can't call us to anything that would keep us from doing what he has already said we need to do. Does that make sense? And again, I'm with you on this. I'm not going, hey, like theoretically, we need to get on point with this idea. I'm saying I really need to come to grips with this reality, because what I can say is, God, you've called me to start this church, and you've given these parishioners all these problems that are so time-consuming for me, and God, I don't know if I can keep up with it, and God, we're trying to do this, and God, Tim's leaving me. Can you believe that? Like, God, Tim is leaving me, and I don't have time to do the second commandment thing. I got to go find a second in charge for Epic. I mean, help me out. All right, I'm better. And I saved the $150 counseling fee. But that's what we think. I'm doing something so important that I can't do what Jesus said was so important. We've forgotten the essence of life. And we've even kidded ourselves about who gets to call the shots in our lives. I don't know your boss. I don't know your expectations. You don't know mine. You don't know the pressure on myself regarding my work. I don't know the pressure for you. And then we have all the family stuff that happens in our lives, and all the friendship stuff, and all the sort of relational stuff, and it's just, we're carrying so much. And we have, every single one of us, we have amazing reasons / excuses for why we aren't doing amazing with the second commandment. But I want to say to us today, could we open ourselves up to rearranging our lives so that we make sure if we don't get anything else right, that we get these two right? At the end of the day, no one else gets to control this for us. Something that God has put on our hearts, and I am just a rookie in this, but I want us to become a people, a church community who take what Jesus said as most important as really important and significant in our lives. And so we're just learners in this. Some of you may be veterans, but I don't think there are a ton of veterans in the neighboring thing in our church. I think there's a lot of us who are just rookies. Here's the deal. If Jesus said that we've got to love our neighbors, we must realize this. I cannot and you cannot love your neighbor if you don't know your neighbor. And we cannot know our neighbor if we don't spend any time getting to know or in conversation or hanging around who our neighbors are. When you received a program, hopefully you got a program this morning, there should be a magnet that looks just like this. Do you have that? This is going to become a great practical tool and a great prayer reminder. Like, fantastic. If you didn't get one today, we've got extras on your way out. You can see in the middle, it says, you are here. Okay, that is your home. or the place that you call home, or whatever square footage your situation is, this is where you live. And then the other 8 squares are people that live around you. Now, I realize it won't be, even for me, it's not exactly in terms of like across the street, across that, it's not that kind of thing. But think of who are 8 of your closest neighbors. I'm not saying 8 people who have San Francisco addresses. I'm saying 8 people who have addresses very similar to yours. They're on your street or just behind you. They're on your hallway or on your floor. I want you to think how many of those, and by the way, use a Sharpie. A pen won't do real well. I had to use a Sharpie. How many of those 8 names, and don't say it out loud, okay? This is not a comparison thing. How many of those 8 boxes could you fill in with names of your neighbors? Yeah, me too. Actually, with my wife's help, I was able to get 6. If you couldn't do 8 names, could you do 8 descriptions? The loud music guy, the girl that doesn't know the difference between compost and recycling. And I'll say this in a little bit, but I think the very first step for us may be just to get this thing filled out, and I want to give us a 2-week time frame to do this. And then let's put it on the fridge, so because we're filling it out and we're trying to remember who lives where, but this is also a great prayer reminder. I mean, assuming you go to your fridge as often as I do, it's a great prayer reminder. Just say, okay, who lives around me? Because first thing that has to happen, I think, is that we need to ask God to help us with our desire to love our neighbors. I think that's something that God, perhaps better than anyone else, of course, can implant in our hearts. But a close second is something that God has given us control over, and it's the thing of our calendar and our schedule. Okay, we want to ask God, would you give me a desire? God, I don't love my neighbors like I want to. God, my neighbors get on my nerves. God, there are days where I wish I lived out in the country. You came to the wrong place if that's most days for you. God, would you give me a desire? But then God's saying, I'll give you a desire, but I've given you X amount of hours per week. I've given you a purpose that doesn't conflict with my purpose of loving your neighbor. Along with this magnet, and where this magnet came from is, you probably saw this in the lobby, but The Art of Neighboring has been a book that's really shaped, and a few of us who have read it over the last couple of years, it's really shaped our understanding of how and what kind of neighbors we want to be. And so we believe in this book, and its practical help so much that we want to give every household in our church a free copy of this on your way out today. So just a small gift. It's an investment from us because we think that if we take some of the principles and begin to carry it out, our church looks different, our streets, neighborhoods, and ultimately our city and the Bay Area can look different if just by becoming good neighbors. Now, if I asked you, are you a good neighbor? Because remember, we love, here's what all of us love. More on this next week, but we all love to do life how we want to do it and to feel like we're doing the right thing, don't we? Like, my big deal when I'm counseling so many people in decisions of life and whether or not they should do this or that, what I come away with, and it's true for me too, is this person and me, we want to do whatever we want to do in life, but to feel good like we've done the right thing. Anybody else? So if I said to you this morning, hey, are you a good neighbor? Maybe most of us would say yes, and our logic would be, yes, Ben, I'm a good neighbor. I don't make excessive noise post 10 p.m. Yes, Ben, I'm a good neighbor. Our stuff is not unkept. We keep our stuff straight. We take we don't leave the trash cans out overnight or whatever the situation may be. But if Jesus were to define neighbor or redefine neighbor for us, I think there would be a different definition than the one I'm using usually in that question. And some of you may say, and I realize this, like Ben in San Francisco, the housing situation, and especially in sort of this kind of buildings that I'm in or whatever the case may be, it makes doing this neighboring thing a lot more difficult. I acknowledge that. So maybe there's some creativity needed, but I do not think that the neighbor command from Jesus was only for those who live in detached single-family homes. So we've got to figure that out. We are in a unique setting. Everything we do in San Francisco is different than we would do it anywhere else, right? I mean, how many churches have you been to around the country where they need to reimburse your parking because parking costs? Anybody? Right? I mean, how many churches have you been around the country that are underneath the CVS? Anybody? Like, we have to do things uniquely. That's part of the fun of figuring out what it looks like to be a church in the urban core of this city and for you to live life. And so let's get creative in how we're going to do it. But these guys, I'll give you one quote from them, page 43 in this book, along the lines of what we're talking about today. And here's what they say. It's a challenging statement. The authors say it's vital to take a step back and ask ourselves if we live at a pace that allows us to be available to those who live around us. It's vital to ask ourselves this question, and it's a question I have to come face to face with this morning, or perhaps the previous week, and a question you need to come face to face with this morning. Does our pace of life, just the pace, we're not even talking about desires, we're not even talking about all of that, does our pace of life in and of itself keep us from loving our neighbors well? And all of us could go, but you don't know my job, Ben. I don't. You don't know the ins and outs of mine. Actually, I just work on Sundays, but you know. But does our pace of life keep us from loving our neighbors well? Because while we need God to change our desires, I think it's still really only us that can change our calendars. And you're just like me. If it doesn't get on your calendar, it doesn't get done. So maybe we look for 15 or 30-minute or 60-minute increments in our schedule and just write the word neighbor time in there. Now, depending on who you share your calendar with, that may seem odd to them, so be careful. And then we just say that's time we're going to be out front. We're going to wander the halls. Don't be creepy, okay? Like there's this fine line. Like don't be that person. All right? Like 2 hours walking inside your high rise down the halls, like looking through the peepholes. Like that's weird. Don't do that, okay? But just get out and be around in spaces where it's more likely to have connection points. And we're not thinking huge. Like, we're not looking for BFFs here, okay? We're not looking for people to split the Costco bill with us, okay? We're just looking for people that are our neighbors that we want to know that we're here. For us, some things that we've done when we moved into this home we're in October, Shauna baked cookies, and we took the cookies over with a card that just had our information and said, hey, here you go. We're the Pilgreens. If you need anything or if you need to tell us anything, here's our contact information. Now, not everyone took the cookies. I mean, we can't be great neighbors to everyone, right? But just saying, hey, here's who we are. That's a simple way to do it. Just to say, yesterday we took a walk, and while on this walk, we ran into one of our neighbors, and Shauna and I talked with him for about 5 minutes. And the reason we were able to talk with him is because we had already got to know him back in December, and so he said, how's the India adoption thing? We called him up on that. We said, how's the insurance claim going for your home? He asked about our middle school situation. We have sons that are in 5th grade, both of us do, and so we just started talking about that, and we ended that conversation really simply just saying, if there's anything that you need from us, please let us know. Sometimes I think it's rocket science to get in these conversations. But really, it's just introducing ourselves. Now, some of us have been living where we live for 6 years and don't know our neighbors. Feels a little awkward, doesn't it? Let's just confess to them. That's what we need to do anyway. Just start it like this. Hey, I've got a confession. I've been a terrible neighbor. My name's Ben. Can you remind me what yours is? And we won't hit it off with every neighbor, but we will find common ground with some. Some will realize that our kids are the same age as theirs. Maybe we'll realize that we're from the same part of the country or from the same part of the world as our neighbors are. Maybe we'll realize that we have the exact same commute, which is always good to know on the one day your car doesn't start or you miss the bus. Who knows what we will realize? Maybe we'll realize we're in the same industry and there'll be some common ground with which to build a relationship on. Like, Ben, that seems uncomfortable. I know. But Jesus died on a cross. I know. I'm with you. It's not my cup of tea. I'm like, God, I'm doing this church thing, and doesn't that give me a pass? No. Unfortunately, no. It's what God's called us to do. And you can do this in real simple ways. For celebrating Chinese New Year, our first grader, Asher, he made a lantern, a Chinese lantern to celebrate the New Year. And he and Shauna went and gave it to our neighbors behind the house who are in their 70s and Chinese. And they appreciated that so much. And now it's hanging in their home. Just those small touches. Back on December 18th, around Christmas, we did a cookies and cocoa night at our house, invited our neighbors, made cookies. Shauna made cookies, and her and the kids are much better at this than I am, truth be told. She made cookies. We invited our neighbors, made hot chocolate. I manned the hot chocolate. I did do something that night. And just we got a chance to get to know our neighbors in our home. And not only that, but we saw them get the chance to get to know each other, which is a great point in all this. I'll say it just briefly, but in most neighborhoods, no one has a home or an apartment unit yet that's serving as the hub for the environment surrounding your home. You and I can become that if we'll act first. What if you become the hub? What if you become the spot? What if you become the family? What if you become the place? This is the natural neighborhood meeting place. What if they know, hey, if there's something we didn't know, we're going to so-and-so's house. I think there's a great thing we can do with that. Speaking of parties, like we were talking about in December, 2 weeks from today, we are going to train you on how to throw great parties. Okay? Yep, you heard that, at church. So get your communication card out. If you want to be a part of that, we're going to give you a free lunch. And Mary Kill, Mary's the wife of Brad, our worship pastor. Mary is going to train you in how to throw great parties. I mean, how many people go to churches like that? And not only that, but if money's an issue for you, we actually are going to give some grants to people in our church to go home and throw some great parties. If you can make this, just RSVP. Just put party training on your communication card somewhere, and we'll follow up with that. A free lunch following 11 o'clock, March 29th, and you're just going to learn how to throw some killer, intentional parties. So all of you who love to be strategic, this will be a strategic thing. All of you who think you're awesome at partying, but you don't do so with a great intentionality and strategy, we're going to reshape that. So still be a great partier, but we want to help you do that with purpose and even with strategy behind it. And so Mary's going to do a great job with that. Now, as we get ready to just put this first message to rest, I want to remind us, we are just starters. We are just rookies. We are just in the starting blocks, but we can have a great desire. At Epic, we have always said, listen, we're all over the place when it comes to faith issues, and maybe even when it comes to this neighboring issue, but every one of us in this room can take some step forward with what we're talking about. And the first step is to get this thing filled out. Like those of you who love practical application, this is a great first step. Just to go, okay, here are the 8 closest neighbors. I learned their names. I learned a little bit about them. Write that in. Keep that on your fridge. It's a great first step. Can you imagine what would happen in our neighborhoods, on our streets, in our city, and in the Bay Area if we became the kind of neighbors that Jesus has asked us to become? If we became the kind of people who loved our neighbors well, our communities would be stronger, our neighborhoods would be safer, we would be able to practically reveal the love of God to the people around us. Now, I know what you're thinking because I'm still thinking it myself. You don't understand how busy my life is, right? Shauna and I are doing this adoption thing. I am trying to lead this church to the best of my ability. I do have a couple of staff hires to make. Not only is Tim leaving me, but he's taking my assistant, but I'm not bitter. He's taking my brother also, but still, I'm not bitter. Okay, 96 hours, I lost my executive pastor, lost my brother, and lost my assistant. But it's true. I'm happy for them. I really am. So I got a lot of things going on. I'm a Little League coach, and we're 2-0, going for 3-0 this afternoon. I'm trying to be a good husband, trying to be a good dad, trying to be a good friend. Like, I'm with you. But let me say this to you and to me, and I mean this sincerely to both of us. No one has ever had a more grand purpose in life than Jesus did. And he had to complete his purpose in a little over 30 years. And no matter how awesome the thing is you're producing, it doesn't touch his. And yet he is a person, I got the word from this book, but he is a person who remained interruptible. Most of us would be like, I don't have time for that. I've got a mission to accomplish, and I'm going to die at 33. I got to go. And what's interesting is that he didn't see the interruptions as interruptions to the thing God had called him to. He saw those interruptions as part of the thing God had called him to. And if we're going to walk in his steps and go, hey, I follow Jesus, many of us will go, yes, Ben, I'm a follower. We need to know where we're headed. And where we must be headed, even if not perfectly, and even if this is in the starting blocks, we must be headed to a place where we become good neighbors. If he gave us 2 things, if we don't get anything else right, we've got to get these 2 right. No matter what the shifts that have to occur. 3 things I think that at least they get in the way of this. Number 1, selfishness. Most of us are more self-absorbed than we wish we were. But again, most of us want to remain self-absorbed but look like we're selfless. But what's the truth in your heart? I just need to confess I am self-absorbed. When I get home, I'm tired like you are. Last thing I want to go do is ask my neighbor what's up. But we need to. Number 2, we're just uncomfortable with it. We're just uncomfortable with it, and we wish Jesus had said, hey, you need to love your neighbor if you're an extrovert. Because we know people who talk to everyone, right? But number 3 is we just have too full of a calendar, and it will keep us from doing even the things we want to do. And we're in control of our calendar more than any of us are letting on. Do you have to make some changes, maybe even job changes? Sure. No one gets to control your calendar. At the end of my life and at the end of your life, we will not be able to point to our boss when God says, how'd you do with those first 2? How'd you do? John 1:14, John looking at the big picture of Jesus' life and him leaving heaven and coming to earth as a little baby and growing up as a human who offered his life. He says this about him. He said, and the Word became flesh. That's Jesus. And Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. What he's saying is this: Jesus put on flesh and moved into our neighborhood. And he neighbored us well. He neighbored us well. Could he have stayed in heaven and loved us like he does love us? Perhaps. But he knew the greatest effect his love could have on us is if he came and made contact. He knew that the greatest effect his love would have on us is if there was a proximity situation, a close proximity situation, where he would make contact, where he would come to us, he would become like us so that he might win us. If we're going to be a good neighbor, if we're going to love our neighbors well, I think first it has to be this reminder that we have received what we didn't deserve. The God who is God took on flesh, came and dwelt all up in our neighborhood. How dare I, how dare you refuse to embody the same? Would you pray with me? God, you know that I and we have such a long way to go in this, but God, I pray that this would be a dynamic first step. God, we believe that you call us to live in places with intention behind that. God, you know the neighbors around us that we don't like and that annoy us. God, you know the neighbors that we don't know because we're busy and they are busy. But God, I pray that this would begin a revolution, a neighboring revolution for us to get to the heart of doing what you say is most significant. God, you know what has to be altered in my own life. I pray I'd have the courage to do so. God, give us the desire. And then, God, give us the courage to make the changes that need to be made so that we could be the kinds of people who humbly but confidently say, if I don't get anything else right, I'm going to major on the things that Jesus said mattered most. In your name we pray. Amen.